Yes, please. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome, and hope you have been having some reflections on what we have been talking about the last 3 weeks now. Um, so we've been setting up a stage for trying to understand the nature of science and the nature of society in order to understand the nature of the relationship between them. And as I said, the field is so vast, like we talked about last week. But I'm trying to look at themes in the context of our societies, Indian society, and related similar kinds of communities around the world. And we've been talking about, in the last session, we were speaking something about the complexity of Indian society and whether the kind of narratives of the science society relationship largely derived from a very small group of Western nations can really capture the complexities of the science society relation in Asia, Africa, Middle East, and so on. Okay. Um, and today I'm going to focus on the idea of science education also, of course, because many of you are involved in this. And we are being hosted by this School of Education at Hyderabad. And also because education is another very important social good. It's a very essential part of what we call a society. But before that, like we have done earlier, let me very quickly run through some questions. We don't have too many questions, so let me just highlight a couple of them, and where it is connected to what I'm talking about today, I will just defer it to that point. There was a question about the difference between social science and humanities. These are distinguished as disciplines. In India, the problem, humanities involve subjects like literature, arts, philosophy, histories. Many people want to classify history as humanities. But one of the problems is our BA program, which is a Bachelor's of Arts in India, in which a lot of people study what they call a social science, often involves disciplines like literature, history, and so on. So I think at that level, there is a kind of overlap, but we should recognize that the social science standard disciplines include disciplines like sociology, economics, anthropology, and so on. But as in the growth of newer and newer kinds of disciplines have been coming, so you can have a little more complex breakup of these two. And it is not as important in our context to break them up because they essentially are, represent different worldviews of the way the disciplines look at the world, methods, the kind of approach to asking their questions. And in the last talk, we saw a little bit about the difference between the humanistic methods and the scientific methods in anthropology, for example. There was another question of why there is no STS institutionally in India, why not like elsewhere. We have discussed this again extensively. It's easy for me to blame the dominant science community for not encouraging these kinds. Where I have tried extensively, and there are many others in India, the small group of people in STS who have tried. We have not been able to establish even independent programs, even a separate master's program in history and philosophy of science, and so on. So, I think it's a much larger problem. But I think we should also ask, why is it the Indian social science community, which was very powerful, like in places like JNU and so on, did not think worthwhile to reflect on the idea of science and its relationship to society more deeply? So I think I would, being outside both these groups, I would think, it is a problem that should have been tackled head on by the Indian social science community and asked why cannot we, how is it that you can study societies, dominantly scientific technological societies of today, without establishing these kinds of programs? So there are a variety of factors, but definitely I know that where science and society have been introduced, in part, like as I said, the Indian National Science Academy program on science and society and so on, are by scientists, for scientists, and at the interest and the pleasure of scientists. And I really don't think of them as any meaningful STS programs at all. what is there is a context in the context of environmental sciences. There is another question, and yesterday I think I responded in part, but let me clarify this, because the question was in the context of environmental sciences, what is the distinction between science and society? Because there seems to be a very large overlap, unlike the other sciences. But I mean, as I said, this itself is a very interesting long debate, and we should do it separately in the context of environmental science. But a quick answer to that is that, like the example I gave last time was that, for example, if there is a meeting on discussing water, then there are technological solutions posed to the problem of water in India, including the river linking program and various other questions related to supply of water in cities and so on. Now, these very often when the people who are involved in these committees respond to this question, they feel that technological solutions or the pragmatic solutions, they do something on the ground, they produce water or distribute water or generate resources and so on. And they are very suspicious of the kind of approach from people coming with questions of gender, marginalization, communities, caste, and so on into this larger debate. So one question is, how do we deal with this? And here I think one of the most useful ways to recognize how to deal with this problem is to question. It's not about disciplines. It's not even like saying bring in a political scientist, a gender studies person, philosophy, etc. It is just to understand what is it that the people in the committee understand by the word water, and what is it that they understand by the word, let's say, environment and nature. The real contention has to be there. That is where our real engagement with scientists, the real question of society's engagement with scientists, has to occur at the level of a debate about the conceptual understanding of the world that scientists bring towards the study of things like environmental sciences, and I think many times in biology also. In other words, what I'm saying is that if we point to them that the very idea of nature that they're invoking is actually a product of a very complex social process in which the community of a group of community of scientists, let's say, through the period of the 19th century and 18th and 19th century, redefine what nature is in order to be able to engage with it in some sense. So I was talking right from the beginning about preparation of an object so that it's amenable to scientific analysis. The first object which is made amenable to science is nature itself, because nature is too complex, it's very big, it's multiply varied, we are part of it, and there are so many of those issues which I briefly talked about earlier. But it is reconfiguring what this idea of nature is that already begins with this first act of the creation of what we call as modern science. So if that is the case, we have to then remind them that these concepts are contested concepts, and we want to have a say in how we will define what we mean by nature, in how we will define what we mean by water. For example, let's take a simple example of a table and say if you have a scientific description of a table in terms of its atomic and molecular structure and not in terms of its shape, color, smell it is having, etc., then one can say, well, that is perfect. I can grant you the fact that you have a particular view of the table, a reductionist view, as some people would like to call it. And I think that is correct and fair for you to have that perspective, because you have reasons for having that perspective, that it is made up of all these atoms and molecules. But that does not exhaust the definition of a table. And therefore, when you stick only to your meaning of the word table and use that to create social policies, then as members of society, we can raise the question and say, no, if you take into account the other aspects of the table, other qualities of the table which doesn't fit into which is not of interest to your scientific view, then we have to figure out how we will include both our views, or your views of reductionist picture of this and my view of the various other aspects of this particular object called table. And once we do that for nature, we are really, we'll really see the complexity of this very idea of nature, the very many different meanings you can bring to nature, water, and so on. And therefore, I think it's not about pro-science or anti-science. We just have to recognize that the scientific worldview, through the kind of conceptualization it does, is one window to the world, and that there are other windows to the world. But we are all looking at the world. We can all talk about the truth of the world that you look at when you look at different windows. So all that this is a plea for when we discuss with them about these questions in environmental science is to be self-aware of what they mean by the concept that they use. And I really don't think the scientific community is self-aware of many of the concepts, including the most basic concepts of mass, time, space, and so on. So I think there is a kind of engagement and dialogue which is necessary to understand how scientific concepts are created, what kind of social influence enter into the creation of scientific concepts, and therefore creation of what we call as science. There was a question about science as the only parameter of being rational. No, as we've been talking about, the question of rational, if it is associated with questions of logical conclusions, coming to correct, valid conclusions based on the data that you have, then it is a very common human cognitive capacity. A child has it, a great scientist like Einstein would have it. What differs is the kind of knowledge, the concepts, the objects which we talk about. So, and also, the ways of checking, as I told you, whether these are consistently logical and so on. So I think there are many, I don't want to therefore diffuse the idea of scientific rationality completely, but it is far more complex than just saying it is just about a simple question of linear rational conclusions. There's another question related to the possibility to get a coherent picture of a complex society. I will begin with that today, so we will try and answer that question. And there's also another very interesting question which asked, how do we compare journalist knowledge as compared to social science knowledge? It actually goes to the heart of many of the questions about social science. Because the journalists are also writing about society, and you have the social scientists writing about society. What kind of knowledge are these? Can we compare them? In fact, for here, it's very worthwhile to go back and remember an old history of the origin of disciplines like sociology. And when sociology begins as a discipline, in order to describe the society, their greatest, what shall I say, not opponent, their greatest competitor was a discipline of literature. Because literature people said something very similar to your question about the journalists. The writers who belonged to literature were actually writing about society, and many of them were also particularly of the genre of the hard realist novels in Britain, where including people like Charles Dickens, were writing very detailed stories about their society. In fact, they are wonderful ethnographic documents of British society, the early industrial society, and you all know about the impact of Charles Dickens' literary works, but also on the imagination of Britain of that time. So the question therefore is, to paraphrase the literature's argument, it is to say, look, we are also writing about society very detailedly. We are also just noting it down, recording it, and we are far better writers than all your sociologists anyway. So, why have a discipline called sociology which would do it? And sociology in response does many things, including modifying the way in which sociology itself is written, and then piggybacking on science to say that what they are doing about society is a scientific writing of society as against literature and so on. So the question about the journalists goes back to the same arguments that social scientists do a lot more than just report about some particular short analysis of society. They too, like natural scientists, bring their own concepts, their own methods, their own internal community preoccupations into talking about the society. So, and there are many similar distinctions between the two. We should also remember that the first lesson when you are a journalist, when you become a journalist, is that they train you in the type of objective writing influenced by the notions of scientific writing and the ideas of science itself. How to be objective as a reporter, how to use your writing. So, for example, just like in science, you don't have journalists writing, I went here, I saw this, etc. So the removal of the human subject, which I told you last time, is a very important preoccupation in science, is also very much present in journalism, or the kind of journalist knowledge. And last two questions. One was the relation between everyday science and science is an interesting question, mainly because, scientists do draw boundaries on what science is. They are not going to very easily give the title of science to many things. They don't even like to give it to social science. In fact, when I wrote the book What is Science, I begin with this anecdote of a famous physicist who gave a talk at the Indian Institute of Science, and he was from Princeton, and he began by talking about a particular event in which the Nobel Prize was being given for economics to Nash. The person was famous for being portrayed in the movie Beautiful Mind. And then this physicist David Gross makes a comment that somebody in the one of the newspaper people asked Professor Nash, "Do you think economics is a science?" And then David Gross answers by saying, "Look, any subject which wants to call itself as a science is not a science. I don't call my physics as a science, but yet it is for them, of course, highest form of science." So, this question about whether they'll allow you to call what we do in our everyday life as science is a very big question. But there are significant overlaps in these kinds of practices of rational activities. I mean, as I said about cooking and other things, we are all constantly, the problem with human beings many times is that it's quite difficult to be illogical. Not that easy. You'll have to figure out where you go wrong in your assumptions which lead to the conclusion which is wrong. But very often our structures of thinking towards deduction and induction are, if you like to take the easy way out, hardwired in some sense. And finally, the question we discussed a lot yesterday, the last question about situation of exclusivity in higher education, and about I'm coming back to it very quickly because the person asked the question, is it a lack of scientific temper and rationality? Of course it is. And the fact that Indian higher institutions, education institutions, as well as science research institutes can continue with processes of exclusion of caste, gender, marginalized in so many ways. And then I can't understand why they would want the people who are excluded to have higher forms of rationality than they have. When their own practices, I think, does not reflect a basic sense of more complex forms of rational thought. But that, having said that, let me just tie up some of the points I said yesterday, since we have finished with the questions, and tie up some of the questions about what we were talking about yesterday or last class on Indian society, because I want to then move into this question of the larger question of education, and in particular the question of science education. So we were talking in the last session about the questions of caste and gender and religion and what differentiates that in the context of Indian society, and what kind of analysis of society do you need in order to be able to make sense of it, especially in the context when you are trying to find and map a relationship between something called society and something called science. And we did talk about some aspects of it, but I want to, and there's been a lot, of course, done by very, very eminent sociologists and anthropologists or social anthropologists in India about understanding Indian society, about feminists in India, one of the most strongest groups of, community of scholars from India. And actually, as a side, if you think about the kind of impact which social scientists in India, that is historians, sociologists, let's call them social anthropologists, because in India it's a little bit of a complex mixture. If you look at historians, social anthropologists, people in gender studies and feminism, etc., I think the Indian contribution to global knowledge system is, okay, I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but let me say it, is significantly more than the global impact of natural scientists working from India. Okay, in terms of not only their impact on the kind of work which is being produced at the global level in these disciplines, but also in terms of their impact on policy, on impact on the nation, and so on, has been tremendous compared to the enormous amount, the disparate amount of the kind of money and manpower or woman power or human power put into the production of natural science in India today. And I think it's worth thinking about it when, because many times social scientists tend to get sort of bullied about these questions about science. It's worth remembering this particular the context of the production of social science in India. But still, there is a fundamental question which many of them have asked and we need to continue to keep asking, which is also the preoccupation of my last two books with Gopal Guru, The Cracked Mirror and the Everyday Social Book, which is what is the social science that we need to do to understand our society? If this is the kind of complexity, and there have been very important influential, for example, influential understandings of caste by German sociologists and French. We have had people like Weber, Durkheim, Dumont, etc. All of them very influentially writing about caste society of India as well as the religious community within India. So one has to ask the question, what kind of frameworks are they already involved in when they bring that reflection on Indian society? What kind of understanding of religion do they have that when Weber makes all these points about religious society of India, what are the presuppositions that they are coming in with, and how do we engage with that? Would that give us an insight into the real nature of what is happening, the social phenomena of religion and caste in India today? And part of this, and I think they have had a great influence, as every student of sociology knows, and we continue to reproduce this repeatedly. And part of that fascination is not just to enter into same old stuff about colonialism, etc., which I'm not going to say here, because I think many of our people who are in these fields have gone beyond that, presumably. But it is also based on two other things. One is that global social science has certain pretensions and desires of the global nature of natural science. And the global nature of natural science is best exemplified in education. For example, if you study masters, let's say in physics, you know typically what kind of courses will be taught, and you also know typically what kind of books will be for general reading for those, the reference books for that course. And that can, you'll be surprised that there can be a very common ground, the same set of text, same classes, same lessons duplicated across the world. So you finish a master's program, you know that there is a lot which has been very similar. Maybe all of you read similar books, whichever continent you are in. That's one way of one representation of the idea of global natural science, because there the question of nature itself is something which is global. There's nothing special to the processes and the signs of nature that is only special to India versus Australia or Africa or America and so on. At least that is a very important belief which sustains the universality of natural science. Should global science be like that? Is society an object like that? Or, should we look at it slightly differently? It's not because of just some aspiration to global social science alone, because, social science as it is practiced abroad does not have this aspiration of global social science at all. While we may want to teach all these great thinkers, and they are very important thinkers, and I think we are very lucky we can teach diversity of texts for our students from different cultures. Although our own teaching is deeply prejudiced because we focus on a few Western thinkers, and we rarely teach people from other parts of the world, including Africa, Middle East, Japan, and so on. But leave that question aside. Could this phenomena itself also be nothing more than the epistemological hegemony of the privileged? In other words, that the epistemological hegemony, I mean that the people who are producing this knowledge, which is part of the social sciences, come from a particular group of small percentage of the world population who then represent our society to us. That's something we need to think about. Okay, there are many complexities. It doesn't mean who we should read and who we shouldn't read, but this is a question which is inescapable when we come to representing description of our societies by different people. And the problems are very deep. The fact that the categories which define society, the way you look at objects of society, the way, as I gave you the example earlier about just friendship, similarly kinship, very complex relationships we have with our, uncles and first cousins and so on. From what I know, what the little empirical data I know, but just to indulge in a bit of a generalization, is that kind of relationship is very different from what happens in Germany or the US or England and so on. And we need to make sense of that. What is it? What kind of description captures it best? Because we also have a problem with language. What kind of languages can capture it best? And it's related to a very important question in philosophy of language, which points out that you have very different types of categories and different types of language. And therefore, when we produce largely social science in English to represent and describe and explain in social processes in India, are we missing out on many of the complexities of these processes because of particular emphasis on this global language called English? The purposes of using social science, creating the knowledge about society, have been very different, and the legitimization of them are very different. So all these questions have an impact on the relationship between science and society. That's the reason why I'm talking about it, and I'm also talking about it in such a brief manner only because to remind us that even if the STS community does not want to act as if all of us exist and we have different kinds of experiences which have very meaningful alternate accounts of how to understand it, it does not matter because this is a kind of epistemological hegemony which keeps getting reproduced. And it gets reproduced not just by them, it also gets reproduced by us when we become part of it. In exactly the same kind of arguments we have heard about caste, the continuation of casteism, continuation of patriarchy, which is reproduced not just by the people who are in power, but also the people at the receiving end. So I'm saying all this because to ask a question, how should education take into account? So if education is not going to mimic many of the problems of social science or many of the challenges within social science, how can we look at this question of education, which can take into account the specificities of the Indian society, which includes a very complex narrative and discourse on gender, caste, and religion? I'm using three very important influences on Indian society. So what should the nature of education be? Education as a social science, in the sense as a particular form of engagement with society, as a very important essential component of what a society is, and how very ideas of society can be defined. So we could ask this question: in what sense, or if you want to talk about education as a science, what should it be doing? In what kind of processes, what kind of objects are we really talking about? So one of the questions we can directly ask, just like I asked about the social science question, that there are problems of categories. For example, the self-description of people about themselves may be very different from a social scientist's description of the way people relate to each other. And as I said, that may depend on various things like language, cultural practices, habits, and many other things of that kind. So if social science has to find a way to draw upon all this and not get too obsessed about this idea of conforming to the language of a global social science, okay, which is important because we want to be accepted by them, that is true. But if you do not want to, if you want to be true to the task of understanding our societies, we need to take into account these kinds of things. So in the same level, in the same way, if I ask that question of education, what does it actually mean? Does it mean that any talk of education in India should take into account an engagement, or should engage with the models of learning which come from this extremely diverse set of communities which constitute this country? And what could that imply, especially if it goes against much of what we get in global education system or global education science, if you like? There are certain patterns. Even today, when we talk about, I mean, so many of stuff I read about education, it will begin with very similar breakups of pedagogy, curriculum, evaluation, standard ways of the subsets within which you look at the education. Is that, from where does that model come from? We could say modern education or secular education, as some people like to call it, and so on. But that itself is a model, right? And where do these models come from? And how do they match with the social experience of the societies, of the wide diverse societies across Asia and Africa and the Middle East, for example? So I'm posing this as a question because as an interlocutor, many of you are in education. I'm sure you've thought about all this and you've probably done many courses and stuff. You're all much more knowledgeable about this than me, but I want to bring this question in order to place it in the context of our science and society engagement, because to me, knowledge, the question of education is an extremely important component of the science-society relation, and which is not often seen as that. And that, I think, especially in the Indian context, we know that it is extremely important because, like I said earlier, it is science teachers who are the foot soldiers of this whole ideology of science that is inculcated in India. And they play such an important role, and they do not belong to the high table of scientists. They do not belong to this hierarchy, the higher position which scientists have given to themselves. But they are the most important component. Without science teachers, particularly in at the school level before 10th standard, I don't think you could have the kinds of narratives about science in the society today as we have today. So I see this as a very important question at the junction of the relationship between science and knowledge. And just to connect us to what we talked about earlier, without talking much about these questions, just so that I want to bring our focus back to our discussion 2 sessions back on how to understand the question of knowledge in these systems. It is to ask, what is the kind of knowledge that you're looking for? What are your objects of inquiry? What is it that you really choose to study? Is it just about content? Is it about curriculum? Is it about pedagogy, for example? Is it about the idea of intelligence? Of course, it is about the questions of learning and teaching in a broader level, and so on. So what is it? As I said, I'm not going to discuss any of this unless any of you have something to share with me on this. But this is to connect us to the earlier system of slides where we spoke about the specificities of knowledge in anthropology, knowledge in philosophy, knowledge in the sciences, and so on. So to me, this question is extremely important because much of what you then say, what you produce as knowledge within the education domain, to me, as somebody from outside who's interested in the question of philosophy of education, I will only be asking the questions, what are the characteristics of the knowledge in this domain that you're producing? What are the conditions? Remember, that's an extremely important question we discussed earlier. That it's not just enough to say, I'm going to create scientific knowledge, do science about this. It's not enough to say that. You have to create the conceptual and material conditions for creating this thing called scientific knowledge. Similarly, because without doing that, you are not going to get anything. You just will be looking at the phenomena, if you like, a bare phenomena or a phenomena which just stares in front of you, and all that you will have is you will see the phenomena. It is like, without imputing anything about intelligence of dogs, and I think animals are much more intelligent than us, and I mean it seriously. But still, it is like saying when a dog looks at a natural or social phenomena, is it going to ask the kind of questions we ask when we look at it? We ask those questions because we are prepared, we are prepped with the conditions which then say objects are different from subject, there's something called objective knowledge, do I see what you see, etc., etc. So if I raise these questions for the context of education, the whole domain of enormous amount of knowledge in education, and as we well know, in India, one of the disciplines, by the way, as I was telling you, that social science probably has had a more significant global impact compared to many of the sciences, especially when compared with the kind of money which has been spent on this field. I think, education in India, educationists in India are also a good example of, batting above their average, as they say. And so I think there is a lot of, things to be happy about, but I'm just raising these questions in order to really provoke an internal thinking about this. So I want to start with these questions as the background questions in education, rather than come with some other purpose. So I come back to the question of if you talk of methods in education, what kind of methods serve the purpose? How are you going to look at any of these questions about education? So I'm setting up all this in order to come to the question of science education as one form of the representation of the relationship between science and society. And there is a long debate in this, sometimes contentious debate on a very fundamental question about science education. What should really be taught as science education? Is it the content of science, or is it the nature of science? So many of the questions we were talking about earlier, for example, about ideas of scientific method, notions of scientific knowledge, how do they come up with a particular kind of knowledge claims that they do? Those belong to a larger notions of processes of doing science. So when somebody invokes the term scientific temper, they are really talking in principle, they should be talking actually about processes of science, not what scientists have just said. That is an utterance of science. And the challenge is whether we should be looking at science teaching should focus excessively on content of science. For example, what are Newton's 3 laws of motion? If I try and remember what I learned from my science in school, and I know much has changed, it's still like I can tell you what Newton's 3 laws of motion are. I suppose we are taught in such a way and that you don't forget those 3 laws of motion and so on. But that was not really about nature of science. It was a very important content of science. It was important to know it because it could solve some problems and so on. And the reason we are asking that question is because it's also related to the question not just about what is science, but it's the purpose of educational knowledge. Why am I even teaching this science? So, I mean, this would be such a blasphemous question, but let's start with a very simple question. Why should I teach all this stuff about physics and then relativity, then quantum physics and so on? After all, most of your students in your class are not going to become scientists anyway, in the sense that they would want to have this kind of knowledge about all these aspects of science. What is it? Why should it, for a general universal education model, why should I teach science at all? Especially when it is at the expense of things like much better teaching of language, or in my own context, I mean, I often worry when we find schools who think that you should not have to teach, I mean, teaching music or theater or dance are not core subjects which all the students should do till they are in 10th standard, for example. I mean, even literature is taught sometimes so badly and in the side because you don't want students to get distracted from their science pursuit. What is that? So when we are doing that, we can just say, oh, that is what schools are doing, or that's what parents want, etc. So we can ask that question in the following sense. What is the purpose of educational knowledge practice? Why do you want to teach what you want to teach to the kids? Is it to give an account of the natural world? Is it you want to tell them why a rainbow is formed, why the sky is blue? And that is very important if you can teach them that. Or you want to teach them why the moon undergoes various phases, right? But in doing this, what happens to the question of science education? What is it that it is actually doing? What is it that it eventually ends up in doing? Does it just become a mouthpiece for science? And I'll explain what I mean by that when we come later. By saying all this, I'm not posing new criticisms on science education and science educationists. I'm trying to show you why the question of the relation between science and society plays out in a very dynamic manner in this junction in the relation between science and society. I mean, why the whole question of education plays out a very important role in this relationship between science and society. If we understand, let's say, the larger purposes of education is not just about telling you something about the natural world, or not even to promote what is called science, but it's always on behalf of other agencies, other agents like the state, community, and most often these days I hear from teachers, even school teachers, that it is parents who really drive a large amount of educational practices in schools today. And in some schools, as I'm sure all of you know well, apparently parents sit in and tell the teachers how they should be teaching the students and so on. So this kind of, it can be legitimized as a consumer model of education, but it is also pointing to this anxiety which is inherent under the idea of education. That is, the very idea of learning is not anxiety driven, and which we know that, for many of our education systems across the world, it's one of the greatest source of stress and anxiety. And in almost all so-called mainstream systems across the world, students are so stressed. The number of children who become sick because of this anxiety related to education is so strong, but all that it does is it shows you that the anxiety which is behind the idea of education betrays an anxiety of other agents who are running your idea of education, including the state, including the community, who wants to make sure its children, who are the future resources of the community, are well trained, or in whatever sense which they think it should be, and the state, which it wants to have enough people who can be productive labor for the state, for example, as one very important example, or parents, of course, who are now, who I think have always had an excessive interest and the anxiousness towards the very idea of education among their children. And so therefore we know, and that there have been many examples of alternate education models which have responded to this question, because all of them recognize that many of the models of education that we tend to practice is not always on behalf of learning, if learning is understood in a true sense of the word, or which are maybe a philosophical sense of the word, etc. So this is a tension which also arises. Okay, this is a crucial point I think we need to recognize in this. It is not, okay, let me phrase this very carefully, because I don't want to be misunderstood here, okay? All I'm saying is that this kind of education, these notions of anxieties related to questions of education, are influenced by certain impulses of modernity linked to the idea of scientific knowledge and scientific practice, including questions of merit. I mean, let's look at two very important categories which are borrowed from science, the practice of science, into education itself as a general category. Remember that they are supposed to be very different. Science education is only one component of the larger image of education that we should have. But of course, that is, fallen way down by the wayside when in India, as Sheldon Pollock in a wonderful long piece had written, where he was pointing out in India was one of the greatest places to learn language. We have some of the best exponents of learning, languages ranging from many of the Indian languages to languages like Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, as well as Persian. People used to come from outside to learn from here. And today we have to send our students outside the country to learn even so-called dominant languages like Sanskrit, Pali, and so on. I mean, this is the point I was raising about in the context of what has happened to humanities learning or language, the importance given to learning languages. But what I'm trying to say is that is part of the reason is because of this way in which a dominant understanding, a relation of education with science, that dominant influences or transmits the prejudices of science towards other subjects and other forms of learning onto education. So education begins to mimic these prejudices of science towards other forms of learning, other forms of being, other forms of thinking, including the arts and the languages and so on. And again, remember, just because we teach better language or arts and philosophy and music and dance does not mean we don't teach science in the way the science community wants science to be taught. That's really not the question. Is it that the larger influence, the fundamental metaphysical, philosophical, conceptual understanding of science has created the state of anxiety? Because 2 points, I mean, there are many other points we can do a map on, I'm not going to do that, but just two of them I can tell you right now is the idea of merit and the idea of competition. This competitiveness, this idea of having exams where only the top 2% get in, top 5% get in, where you have enormous amount of, coaching classes. I mean, I know in Bangalore now, this is too painful for me to, understand and engage with. 6th standard children are now doing training in IIT after the regular class hours. There are kids from that age who are spending from 6:30 in the morning till 7:30 in the night in these schools which have done this integrated stuff. And everything is about competition and meritoriousness. And one small kid once was telling me, she said, my AIR is something, some 300 something. And I was like, what? And then she tells me it's called All India ranking, and she's in 6th standard. Among some ranking they do every Sunday, they write an exam, and they are, All India. I suppose many of the schools do it or something like that. Where does that come from? Where do these questions of merit and competition comes from? It's inherent to the idea of the discourse of science. And these may be strengths. I'm not even going to put value judgments on it. I'm just saying, when I look at this question, the domain of education and the domain of science, and I'm seeing this very important relationship between them, and I see education as standing for a core value of a society, then we need to ask, how are these very complex ways by which science begins to influence various basic functional parts of what a society is. If we forget about all these as the elements of learning, including merit, competition, on behalf of other things, and just think that the basic question of education is not to cater to the best, but actually to the quote average and poor learners, and taking into account what we mean by saying that they're average and by choosing systems which they cannot compete with, that doesn't make them poor. So how do we incorporate all of that into our questions of education? So if I begin with the larger idea of education, which has always been this is the thing which educationists have always told us. Educationists across the world, including some of the most important educationists in India, or whether it was John Dewey, or in the Indian cases, right from Gandhi, Ambedkar, Tagore, and later on even up to people like Krishnamurti and so on, we have had very thoughtful ideas of what education should be. That education is about not just about particular subject matters, not about state of affairs of the world, not about factual list of facts about the world or people or whatever it is. There are civilizational values which are present in it. There are social values which are at the heart of it, including questions of citizenship. It is an inculcation of democratic values. It's an inculcation of just the basic ethical ways of being with each other. And definitely knowledge is part of all this. But where a definition of knowledge is in conflict with any of this, then there is a conflict within the idea of education. When you have a model of what you mean by education, by what you mean by knowledge, which goes fundamentally in conflict with these larger ideas and the aims of education, the very meaning of what constitutes education, then definitely there is a fundamental conflict in the way we understand education today. Now, you might say the quick answer to that is, of course, well, if the definition of knowledge itself includes civilizational ideas, citizenship, democratic, humane and ethical ways of living together, then you are not in a problem at all. Many of the alternate systems of education which I find, I can see how you can map how they approach the question of knowledge, what it is to know, under what conditions should one know, not competitively, not because I want to come first, I want to kill you in writing this exam and so on, but through other kinds of values. So there is both knowledge, but the idea of knowledge itself is imbued with all these characteristics. And the first thing we have to recognize, and we have seen this, I mentioned this earlier, in the history of the notions of scientific knowledge, there comes a moment when as an institution, scientists begin to define begin to dissociate the question of ethics from knowing. A very fundamental preoccupation in quote unquote scientific society, like pre-modern science societies, where that the knower and the known were always very deeply related. The person who is knowing and the knowledge that kind of person who creates were linked. And there was a question of ethical moral pressure inherent in the characteristics of knowledge. So you could not know whatever you wanted just because I thought I want to know something about it. And that knowledge, that definition of knowledge has to get changed in order for scientific knowledge to become dominant. And that's a historical, very well understood process. And when maybe in the last session, I want to come back to the question of ethics. I will also give you a reading for that. It's a long piece I had written earlier on ethics of curiosity. And you can see historically, a lot of very interesting work is there on this. We know how the very idea of knowledge, so in other words, the conditions for producing science as a social institution, okay, which legitimizes the kind of knowledge it produces. For science to create that social institution, it needs to not just have more money, have more scientists, etc. It needs to change the basic concepts which society held at that time, including the concept of what you mean by knowledge, what you mean by truth, what you mean by evidence, what you mean by nature. Unless you change the conceptual understanding of these major important terms, you cannot produce the kind of an institution of science that we produce. So, if this, let us assume, at least for all of you as education professionals, I'm going to assume for TISS Hyderabad students and who are other educationists who are here in this dialogue, that all of you believe in these larger aims of education. And if that is so, then it raises a question for you as if you are science educationists, which is that should science and therefore scientific knowledge be taught as a social process? Because it is only through by teaching it as a social process that you can reach the larger aims of education which we mentioned here. It is not by teaching science as saying these are Newton's 3 laws of motion, that's the law of gravity, and I can teach you what d by dx of x squared is, etc. That is not fulfilling any of the larger aim of education, which includes humane, ethical, civilizational, citizenship, democratic values. So if you accept that this is the aim of education, then you have to ask the question, how should science be taught then? Not whether science should be taught, in terms of content or I would think of the nature of science debate as ways of looking at some of the values. Okay, so that's why I would tend to move towards that. But I would extend it larger to say that only when science is taught as a social process does it function as science education. If you do not teach it as a social process, you are teaching vocational training without putting down vocational training. It's a pragmatic, you're creating a vocation of a science, not knowledge, and not as a social good. And I think that tension, I want to frame that tension in that manner. And I hope, I'm sure many of you might disagree with me on this, but, I think it's worthwhile probably having some disagreement so we can, take it forward. In other words, what does it mean? Should science be taught as a social process? Should what you teach in science to children be truthful about the practice, aims, and methods of science? And therefore reflecting the larger social responsibility of education. And I was just reminded, I just put ICER here just to remind me of an example that it is not just about primary or secondary or middle school education I'm talking about, or even high school education. We can see this even in higher education. This very good experiment which was started in India about these ICERs, which are science education and research, very good, I think, where we finally broke this science research institute versus university teaching model. And, I was part of a curriculum committee of one of the ICERs, which I really enjoyed interacting with them. And I think it was a time when it was first set up where they were very open about looking at having other kinds of courses. And I remember, so I was representing this question of history and philosophy of science, And because of the openness of the director, this is Raisa Mohali, and Satyamurthy was there, and he was very keen that we do this, and we were able to introduce courses in history and philosophy of science and Indian society, etc. All of them as necessary courses for the students. And some of the faculty were a bit worried and said, why would they have to do all these kinds of courses? And one of the things I always have said to them in all those 3 years I was a member of the committee, and when we went and visited the students again, was to make a simple argument. The argument I made was very simple, and I still believe in it. I said, ISER is funded by the government. At that time, they were paying fellowships for all students who entered ISER, and I was like totally shocked, because I was engaging with the problems in places like Karnataka. PhD students in social science were not getting 3,000 rupees a month if they got any money, and these kids that come after 12th standard were getting 5,000 rupees as scholarship to study science. Okay, and I mean this disparity continues today. Today, PhD fellowships in all the good science institutes are supposed to be around 40 or 45,000 or something like that, and we still have hundreds of social science students, including in education, having fraction of that money, if at all they get that kind of money. Anyway, the point about ISER, which the argument that I often made was this. I said, you are now teaching 100 students. You're training them with very good faculty, very good, resources, wonderful labs, and so on. But not 100 of every class is going to become a scientist. And that was my argument to the faculty. I said, you're training, you're putting all this into the students, but maybe 20 to 25% will become scientists. And what are you going to do with the remaining 75 to whom you're given this kind of training, where your educational model is assuming that all 100 are going to be great scientists? But as I said, if you train them well in science and also train them, let's say they can become, in the other social science disciplines, you can create a very good corpus of historians of science, philosophers of science, science communication, science educationists, and so on. And I think that's the social responsibility of education. It's not about the content. It's not about making everybody who studies science wanting to become a scientist. So therefore, when we do not look at science as a social process, not taught in this particular manner, it has many, many implications. One of them is that, and I think this is a point we need to come back, and I know some science people might get very upset when they see this. There is a major difference about it, but I want to ask us to think about this, and we can, in the end, say, no, it is not. But let's at least think about the fact that in so doing, we create both science and religion as ideologies. They are taught as ideologies. Science is taught as an ideology in school, and religion as ideologies in homes, or perhaps in the other cultural sphere. And taught as an ideology is something which is completely different implications for the nature of science education. Okay, so to give you a quick, there's much more about this which I've written in this piece called Indian Experiences with Science. So that's my reference for this 1 or 2 slides which follow. And as I said, it is much larger piece, and I will send that also as part of reading when I send all the other papers to them, so you can access it if you're not able to access it elsewhere. This is a major international handbook on science education and science teaching. So I was looking at some of the debates in that, and again, it makes a very important point. So I want to look at this particular connection to science studies as we have understood it and the challenges in science education. We know that this is a point which some of the scholars have been repeatedly pointing for quite some time, which is that science textbooks continue to ignore history, philosophy, and sociology of science. It's a global phenomenon. So there are people from different countries point out how science textbooks act as if there are no disciplines called history, philosophy, and sociology of science, which have contributed to our understanding of science. And part of the same within the community, it is positioned as a nature of science debate within science education. Turner and Salinger point out to certain very simple reasons for this, and I think this is again global. This is very much part of what happens, I think, from my limited understanding of what happens in science education in India. So some of the reasons which they point out is that when you are teaching science, there is only time only for core science content. You cannot teach, laws, Newton's laws, plus history of Newton and what this fellow did and what is the economical costs of doing science, etc. That's a standard argument. And the second point they point out is that teachers have little training or exposure to the disciplines of history, philosophy, and science. Many of them are science teachers who have come from a system which have only taught them science in a particular way, and they come and they reproduce that. And they may learn various other skills of communicating science, but most importantly, and this is I think the fact that this quotation is not about the Indian case, that it is globally present, and that's why I put the quotation fully here, that teachers share many scientists' disdain for what they regard as soft add-ons. And this is quite remarkable, because within the community of scientists, there is the constant puzzle with them is not even about, whether certain kinds of knowledge systems are better or not. Who cares? If there is something which works, you're able to understand something, we accept that there are very good, very, very powerful methods which are present in science. But it is just that based on ignorance, when scientists put down social science knowledge and social science practice, it is not because they know the complexity of social science knowledge and social science practice, or that they have understood what is the strength of their own methodological practices, if at all they practice methodology other than rule following. Remember we talked about everyday science, everyday practice of scientists. But the fact that the disdain comes purely from ignorance and is ideological, a kind of a position of power whereby I'm in a position where I can say that and get away with it, because we do not have sufficient opposition to ask them, how can you say that about something which you have no clue about? So the fact that that is taken up by the teachers, I think is an extremely worrying trend. It's something very worrying, which we should all be worried in the context of education, because it is not about, criticism of science or criticism of social science or criticism of philosophy. Whenever scientists, in my experience of years of being around many of them around science institutions, whenever you talk about history or philosophy or sociology or science, people think you're being anti-science. We are not being anti-science. We're just trying to understand something. Another reason which Turner and Salinger point out is that why teachers resist getting into the nature of science teaching within science education is because they feel it leads into too many other discussions, including politics, economics, and so on. Okay, and again, very interestingly, in the literature which you see on science education, which I had to look at extensively for writing this piece, there is little in science education about scientific traditions from other societies, including Asia, India, Asia, Africa, China, etc. There will be some small lesson somewhere saying, Chinese built all this stuff and Indians did some mathematics here and there, but nothing about the substantial conceptual ideas about, nothing. There have been a few, and there's now more, I see a little more in the literature about it nowadays, but the questions of whether these kinds of experiences with science can contribute to new ways of talking about the nature of science debate, because wherever there has been nature of science debate, it still reduces to the standard scientific method debate, which is a very distilled version of some other debate in philosophy. But we could ask another question. When I say this, somebody who's working in the field abroad might say, well, okay, you can say it, but are they even relevant? Are these scientific traditions or rational traditions in Asia, Africa, etc., are they relevant? Because today, when you're talking about such advanced knowledge systems in science, how are they really relevant? So one counter argument I pose to this, not to the last question, but to looking at the nature of science debate, is to say, well, I agree when the teachers and scientists say, don't bring in HPS, don't give in all the stories. I want to teach the students what Newton's 3 laws of motion is. I want to give them problems at the end of their lesson so they can solve some problem. If force is some 10 units and mass is 2 kilograms, 10 newtons, 2 kilograms, what is this? Acceleration. That's to say, I want students to solve that kind of a problem. Don't add other stuff of HPS. My argument to this is that any text you take, any scientific text you take, there is already an invisible presence of history, philosophy, and sociology of science present. It is present in the very choice of the material you put in the book. So if I give a lesson which says, okay, this lesson I'm going to study Newton's 3 laws of motion, and you present it, and I first read all the children read 3 laws of motion, I mug it up or by heart it and learn how to solve some problems with it. You could ask the question, why is this in the lesson? At that point in that lesson. Why are you starting with Newton's 3 laws of motion? Did we talk about various other ideas of motion, starting from the Greek views of motion to Indian, to the Chinese, to various other communities? I'm not talking about just philosophies, I mean various communities' understanding of motion, and then lead up to Newton's laws of motion and say, hey, look, what does Newton's laws of motion show us? It shows us something really remarkable, different description than all these other kinds of descriptions of motion. That's not how we start. The fact that you start with a given content is already a particular choice of a history, a particular presentation of the history, a particular presentation of a philosophy and the sociology of science which is present in it. For example, if you look at Newton's 3 laws of motion, and I mean, as I said, all of us have by-hearted it so much that we know exactly how to, we use the same words which I learned in school. But even the questions of mass, velocity, the first law on inertia, etc., it does not begin with Newton. There is a very interesting history within his own European context by which he develops from a historical trajectory of what these ideas of mass, velocity, inertia, etc. were. And one of the great, lovely poetic descriptions of it, which I can't forget, is Kepler's description of inertia as plumpness of matter. Plumpness, like it's sort of more weight than it should have. It doesn't want to move that easily, which captures the idea of inertia, which Newton captures in his first law of motion in a very interesting way. But it derives from a particular trajectory. And when you start with Newton without giving the whole historical way on how these other ideas are modified by Newton, what you are teaching, what you are doing is, you are presenting a particular restricted, revisionist history and philosophy of science within textbooks, which is taught day after day to our teachers, to our students. And every page you take can have stories like this. The fact that when you talk about some of the most interesting ideas in biology, about notions of life, etc., there is absolutely no representation of vast communities of people who have thought about meaning of biological life in a very rich sense of the word. And we think that that's not to be called biology, that's not biological knowledge, and I'll begin with Darwin or Mendel or something like that and start with humanity. I think you're already missing out. You're choosing a particular history and philosophy. So when science content people and teachers tell me we don't want to deal with history and philosophy of science, I tell them no, you're wrong. You're already in a midst of the history and philosophy of science, sociology of science, and you're not acknowledging that. You're just not seeing it. And the reason why this becomes a particular problem is because we come back to the very simple question. Are science teachers going to be the foot soldiers? Are they going to be the voice of scientists or science community or science institutions? And who therefore was going to decide on content to be taught in science? How do you decide which science educationists among science teachers autonomously decides, okay, 4th standard I teach this, 5th standard I teach, 6th standard, 7th standard I teach this, and so on? Is it even a collaborative process? I mean, of course, we have NCRT, we have committees which have different members of this, and I'm not saying that it is not done. Across the world, there have been very interesting experiments on writing science textbooks, etc. I'm raising this question in order to respond to this debate on the nature of science and the argument that we don't have time to do history, philosophy, and sociology of science in the science content. Because after all, especially today, as we saw in my earlier talk, with the enormous amount of production of knowledge over which we seem to have absolutely no control, somebody has to decide what you are going to keep. Somebody has to keep your textbooks. And we know that what happens in the rewriting history, all kinds of political issues which have come up. But is it very obvious in science that it is not happening? That you're not allowing, that somehow across the world everybody has decided these are the most important aspects of science which a child should know, and that for some reason they should know about relativity first before I teach them something else. I mean, you're making, what I'm saying is you may have very good ideas to do it, but you're making fundamental assumptions about cognitive capacities of children, about scientific topics and scientific ideas, because you have reduced science to a particular kind of the so-called logical method, that you forget that the complexity of science means that you will find children responding to different ideas from so-called higher levels of what is taught in sciences. You'd be surprised at how they might respond to it at lower classes. You know, when I started this philosophy for children, almost without exception, everybody told me, how can you teach philosophy for children? What is there for? It's too difficult. Already for adults, we are not getting people to come. Where will children come to learn philosophy? And when the first workshop I did, we had over 150 applications and we couldn't accommodate all of them. So I did a series of them just to accommodate the people who wanted to come, because I didn't want to choose some people and we don't not choose other people. We have done it across with my students. I've gone to different places in India, doing it in small rural areas and cities, and you find the kind of people who come to that, children who come and sit in it. And we talk about things ranging from, experience, phenomenology, what some philosophers might call as phenomenology, some will call logic, etc. And for the children, they have very different ways of engaging with it. But I can't write a textbook on that, although I'm now doing a book for philosophy on children, which is trying to get them to think through this. I'm saying a textbook, once it becomes into the produced within a state structure or under the pressures of an education community or the parents, it becomes a completely different ball game. But in that, we are choosing what we mean by progression of learning, although there are very important models of learning within that. And I'm sure all of you are very well, you know this better than I do. But many of you will have to ask yourself, I'm just going to leave this as an open question, we can talk about it later. Among the models of learning, whether it's Piaget, Vygotsky, etc., how many of them are actually influenced by particular understanding of learning science? And how much has that influenced the way we even understand models of learning in education? Okay, so one major question, and I won't have time to just, I think we have time, yeah. So I'll try and now wind up at this point, and then we'll take your comments. So one of the reasons I'm concerned about this kind of teaching of science education is that this model of teaching makes science as a revelation. That is, when you tell me that Newton, by seeing an apple fall on his head, which we know is an apocryphal story, which didn't happen, but just from that story, suddenly Newton is supposed to have got Newton's law of gravity. That's magic. That's not science. That's revelation. You could look at Newton's great book, Principia, as a, one of these revelatory religious texts. If you teach them that way, because unless we know that Newton's processes of thinking which led him to come to these laws, and the processes of thinking which included mistakes, which included a very deep theological influence on how he constructed his picture of the world, then all you're trying to tell children is somehow there are these great scientists and all of them are white and from Europe at that time. You don't have anybody, there's no male white men sitting around discovering all these great truths, and they give you this as sudden reasons, magic bits of knowledge which we are supposed to somehow recognize that, wow, this is amazing, this person has discovered it. Or suddenly how Copernicus discovered the heliocentrism. I mean, Copernicus is not just an astronomer, he's not just a historical figure. He is, he's a metaphorical figure who stands for all revolutions. There is Copernican revolution in philosophy. Kant uses that Copernicus. There are people who, when they talk about a major shift in their, perception, a sudden shift from their recognition and understanding of something, they say it's a Copernican revolution. I mean, he is a figure far beyond just his, bodily historical figure as an astronomer. But how did Copernicus come to the heliocentric? Suddenly he thought about it. He had, as we discussed earlier, the same kind of data, almost similar data as Ptolemy, used very similar conceptual apparatus, and then comes up with the heliocentric view. Teaching science is not that Copernicus had discovered the heliocentric view, and nobody else before him had thought about it. That's wrong. It's unscientific to teach science that way, because it makes scientists become like priests, and you then you reduce a scientific textbook into information bits which children know, and the impact of it. Again, I can tell you from my children's workshop in philosophy, when I'm trying to talk to some of these kids, when these workshops we talk about what is thinking, mind, etc. And it's astounding. It's happened to me so many times in these workshops, particularly in urban cities like Bangalore and Delhi, where when I'm talking about something called the mind, it's amazing how much these little kids, and I do this for 6th, 7th standard kids, 5th, 6th, 7th standard kids onwards. There are these kids who tell you with great confidence some neurobiological fact about the brain. This is how the mind is. This is how the brain is. There is some synapses. There are neurons firing. So it is not just that that they are taught that. It is taught in a particular manner that you get a great sense of privilege from that knowledge. And you're able to tell people in their class, to their own other colleagues, other kids who are sitting with them, or even to all of us who are trying to engage with them in the workshop, that that's the way it is. And we know that because we have studied in science, and I've done a lot of science. I read a lot of these science encyclopedia books, like one kid told me. So what is this idea of science which then becomes part of our social thinking? How does it become, where is the value that science gets within society through such processes like this? And we do this even as adults. So much of the corona, my God, we see it all the time, everywhere. In all the people around me, in all the phone calls, net, etc., nobody has once asked me, can you tell me how do these guys know? It's just a curiosity question. Forget about anything else, not questioning them. Hey, how is it that this coronavirus looks like this? Does it really look like this? It's red and purple in color and all these things pointing out. How do these guys know actually? Did they take a photograph of it? How did they take a photograph of it? We have gone beyond an engagement with science. And that's what happens when you become a religious society. When religion is no longer something which is experiential, which changes the self in our knowing, but it becomes something which is functional and utilitarian and accepted in a particular manner. And when that happens, the distillation of science in the society functions exactly in a similar manner. And when science is taught as facts and not processes, we forget to teach the ethics of it. So none of our science texts can even raise the question of the ethical questions of knowledge once you reduce them into system of facts which we teach. If you do not teach them with this whole process of historical, philosophical, sociological people who created those objects, what kind of people are they, where did they come from, we completely miss out on a primary purpose of education. We are not missing out on scientific knowledge at all. They don't care whether you tell them all these stories, whether it's ethical or not. But you are missing out on being an educationist. We are not doing education, we are only doing science. Okay? So I'm going to, I think, therefore, I thought I'll just end with this, last slide on, and also I thought, a lot of people have reduced, I've been saying that critical thinking is a very important part of teaching science, etc. I look at all that, of course, but I think one of a very interesting way, pedagogically also, in making this kind of scientific temper in a meaningful way, not in an ideological way that some people are doing in India today, is to actually teach children alternate explanations, and treat them as adults in thinking through this. And I think they will get a lot more about science than this anxiousness present within science and anxiousness present in some people who think, people who have not done science don't have any rational temper, and therefore it is so important upon them as scientists and thing to go and liberate all these poor marginal people who don't have that capacity. We know that like in all societies there are the other side, and in all, as I told you the other day, like people with what happened at Dabolkar and all are terrible. I mean, they have to be treated as criminals, and that's a social problem. But whether it has something, whether that justifies the kind of science teaching we are doing in our schools today, across the mainstream schools across India, is something we have to take into account, and we have to ask that question as educationists. So I'm just going to stop at this point and say, just so that it doesn't look like I'm just complaining about everything rather than coming up with ways in which one thinks about it. And as I said, as a working from within philosophy of science largely, with some history of science and sociology of science, I just want to look, I was asking myself, what would I then teach? How would I teach? We know that there's a problem with time and etc. There's too much knowledge to be taught, etc. But the great thing about teaching science for me is that you teach certain core principles and ideas and ways of thinking, and you don't have to teach everything. So children will learn on their own, and so it's important. The problem is that if you think you have to teach all the content, you don't have to, and that I think is a strength of particular forms of scientific thinking. So to me, I think some of the important ways of teaching some of the science content would include how this idea arose in a historical social context, and it's a nice story, and it's not going to take as much. You're not writing historical history of science papers there. We know how to distill that in order to communicate, to recognize, to make them keep remembering that it is a social process. And for many times there's this, there's a very good work in philosophy of science on how the idea of visual imagery was so important with many famous scientists, but you can see even in the practice of ordinary, everyday science, visual imagination, literary imagination plays a great role in how scientific ideas have come and how scientific ideas have been justified. And these are all well recorded stories which are present, and it makes that science learning very important. The stories of accidental discoveries, aesthetic elements, which makes the children realize that, okay, it's all not about this kind of one kind of hardness, this kind of some kind of a merit which you need in order to be able to do science. And for me, the fundamental reason for giving you all these things about local context, situatedness, also mentioning things like social purpose, how much military has driven the growth of scientific knowledge, how much it has done, and how much business and capitalism has contributed to the very idea of science, and related to that, it's also business is hand in hand with science in the context of ideas of merit, effectiveness, competitiveness, and so on. And it also sensitizing children who learn about this to know what different members of society have contributed to scientific knowledge. Some of the best examples from the Great Revolution in the Asian region, in India, for example, where blacksmiths produced some of the greatest works in metallurgy at that time in the world. And how do children process these things when they listen about it? How do they then look at somebody who they think is doing some meaningless labor in the hierarchy within societies, when they look at people who are laboring and look at them as saying, oh, what are they doing? They're just, we are doing the more serious work of learning science, which is something to do with the intellect. Whereas the recognition that just the stories of science are built from pure aspects of physical labor, which has created the science which is made possible today. How does that change a child's view of understanding what science really means, not one particular religious model of science? And my own interesting example, like the Copernican thing, is simple questions like, why are the phases of the moon? How does one think about it? That's what I gave this example to illustrate what does it mean to teach as a process. And that's a very good example because Galileo's work on the phases of the moon needed his great skill as an artist and his training earlier as a draftsman, which allowed him to be able to make sense of this particular question, by the way. So this kind of different skills which come in together, different ways of learning which constitute science. And all of this for what? Why would we think this is important? Because science education, because science is important, because ways of thinking like science are important, it has to be more egalitarian. And repeatedly, science education in India, like elsewhere, have only been in the business of exclusion. And it's duplicated all the time in our science institutes today, like in other educational institutions. A constant attempt to exclude people who are not good enough to enter into that domain. And that's a larger problem, as we saw, just about the very idea of knowledge itself, which cannot have the element of the ethics within it. But the reason why all these are important is not to, please scientists who are producing some work. It is to pay heed, to listen to the most fundamental aspect of what education means. That notion of egalitarian impulse, that notion of democratic citizenship, that notion of equality between human beings is not going to come from saying, I know this, you don't know it, therefore you fail, you're out of my class. It comes by showing these complex stories of science education. So it brings in people who feel excluded by the way science is taught today, brings them back into the fold, because by keeping them out, like I told you the other day, by keeping them out, we are producing mediocre science institutionally across the country today. Not there are individual brilliant scientists, we all accept that. Institutionally, if you're producing average science, it's because of this history of exclusion, which begins from our science texts and the way science is understood by science teachers and taught as science education. So with this, I will stop for today. Thank you.
We may open the chat box for questions, please. Devansh?
Yes, sir.
Is the chat box open for questions?
Yes, sir, it is open.
Yeah. Yeah.
If somebody wants to ask something in the meantime, what do you think?
We can open the floor for questions also. We request the participants to also raise hands if they want to ask questions.
Okay, I can pick up some as we start.
Srajana.
Sorry, somebody has a question?
Yes, Srajana, you may please ask the question.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Hi. Yeah, my question is about, could you comment on the role of labs in science education? Laboratory.
Yeah. Laboratories are very important aspects of learning, and one of the things I've been talking about social science education, where I have talked a little bit here and there about it. I've often said that there should be laboratories for social science learning also. Laboratories in the sense, I want to use that sense of laboratories as experimenting and intervening. Engaging learning from a very different type of learning, which is not just by so-called sitting and thinking about something, but doing things with the hand, exploring in the true sense of the word. We know, for example, some of these alternate schools have this exploration. They go off on nature exploration. They do things, various kinds of things with hand. And some of them have classes in art, largely art classes as a form of doing this, etc. But definitely, it's a very important idea in across all fields. I don't think it's just about science. I think even for philosophy labs are a very good idea. But the problem is that in science labs are very specific, specific goals. And it's largely been the case, maybe with the higher order science labs or maybe in some of the ISers, they now have a different idea of exploration. But for many of us, in my own science labs, as I remember, in colleges and schools, it's like you have an answer which you have to get. So there, a lot of the lab work is doing the reproduction job of science to show, so that functions as a very interesting ideological equipment, because in labs, we can see how all of us, through doing that experiment, will come to the same answer. And we know that I have done it in my labs, and I'm sure many of us, maybe not, many of you may not have done it, because what I did is somewhat unethical, I guess. What we do is, when we didn't get, my friends and I in the lab, we know, for example, let's say, find the specific heat of copper or something. We know the answer to that, right? So what we would do is we will, somehow create something so that the answer is very close to it. And the point for us is not seeing why the answer was wrong, where would it go, if I had done it exactly, would the answer be wrong? No, there's so much anxiety again. Anxiety to match this one particular value which all of us in the class in the lab should get. And so I think, that exploratory openness and not succeeding in measuring what you need to measure, etc., are extremely important aspects of good lab teaching. I know that maybe some so-called good schools, open schools might do it, but in general, even in colleges, even in engineering labs, where there must be a lot more pragmatic exploration, doesn't happen. Because again, it's connected to marks, internal evaluation, making sure you get this, etc. So much of the spirits of labs are lost in the labs. They just reproduce the anxiety of textbooks and classrooms.
We have a question from Vivek. So maybe we can take that. Vivek, could you go ahead with your question?
Hi, Sundar. Thanks. So my question is, just as how science education needs to be softened in course, shouldn't humanities education be hardened and made scientific for it to gain value in our society, given that it's already considered soft? What is your thoughts?
So there are two ways of doing this. One, you could say, like, look, there is a hegemonic force, and all of us can now begin to conform to them, so in order to get value in society. Okay, I mean, what you're asking is very important, and it has influenced a lot of, and that is the basic reason why there is so much of resistance towards social science and humanities. So when I'm giving you this example, I'm not negating the importance of what you're saying, but I'm giving this example to say, just to illustrate it. Suppose a society is dominantly filled with very corrupt people, and that's the hegemony of the society, that unless you are corrupt, you're not going to survive, which I'm sure many people keep telling us all the time. I'm sure you know many people telling you this. So then the question would be to say, well, am I also going to become corrupt in order to get value in society, or will I not? I'm not saying scientific thing is about corruption or not, but you can see it's about hegemony and power. So I agree with that. Scientists will keep putting down by saying humanities, what is humanities education is very quote unquote soft. Within the sciences, they used to call biology as the soft sciences. So biologists are trying desperately to show how hard science they are in various ways. Okay. So, but I think that's an internal preoccupation with this whole questions of competition and, anxiety driven search for knowledge. But the counter to that is to say, well, how do we as a humanities community communicate the kinds of hardness of our disciplines? And people, the scientists may not accept it, but I think our interlocutors are a very different set of people. In a very funny sense, we are both playing to the gallery, to the common public, in a true democratic sense of the word. And if you have enough people enough parents and children saying, oh, I'm going to study, literature, or I'm going to study philosophy or arts or music, compared to the people who are getting pressurized into studying this thing called science, then definitely you are, finding ways to respond to that hegemony. That's all. I'm not saying it's, doable or not. In the institute I was in, the NIAS, it was a great experiment in bringing natural science, social science people together. And the hope was that, some way there would be some kind of true interdisciplinarity. But I think part of the reason it absolutely failed was that the science people who were there just couldn't understand the meaning of social science practice and knowledge. To the extent that I have, what used to bother me is that when PhD students who go out into the field and have suffered so much, they come and they present their work, they would just be told, what is this? This is not knowledge, this is not this, this is not that. I mean, they were also, of course, very famous for calling gender studies as domestic problems. It's not really a discipline. So we need to fight. We need to figure out ways, not on their account of what is rigor, but with our own ways of doing our job to communicate there. And I think humanities scholars may fail a little bit in that, but we don't have to be as anxious as them to claim that their notions of rigor, etc., is a universal model. In fact, I think HPS is an attempt to keep showing the mirror to them, and that's why the science community hates HPS. Why is it that in none of our IITs and ISERs, which are government-funded major institutions of science education, science and engineering education, they do not want to hire good HPS scholars in their humanities departments? What are they scared about? That mirror which they are seeing, that, hey, look, I don't see the scientific method in that work you have done, or that these are the processes of exclusion that has built this particular knowledge system. And until, as a community, as a society, we make them answerable to these public ways of functioning in these institutions, then it will be a struggle. It has become far more successful in other countries. But India has a long way to go, because we are essentially a feudal society still.
Two more hand raises. One is from Siddharth and the other from Subro. So I invite Siddharth to ask his question. Siddharth? I'm sorry, he's
okay.
So maybe we can take the question from Subro.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I guess he's here.
Hello.
Yes, Siddharth. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, Professor Sarukkai, I really enjoyed the session today. I was really struck by the anecdote about the ISR curriculum that you mentioned there, where you had to explain to scientists that it's important to include humanities and social science subjects. I'm myself a product of the Indian Institute of Science and the course there. And I must admit that there is a huge expectation that all the students must become scientists, despite having humanities courses in the curricula. So what can we do to fight this notion that all the people who come out of these programs have to become scientists, and there is no widespread appreciation or acknowledgement that people who have studied science can also go into science policy, can become IAS officers or stuff like that. And because I'm a science communicator and I work in Bangalore, but I've had to face a lot of stigma from my colleagues, from people who have taught me, because they fail to recognize what I do as important or as worthwhile of doing. So what can we do to change this higher notion of that science students should only do science?
Yeah, and not only science students should, and science students leaving science to other things is a betrayal of some sense, or that science students, they're not good enough, so they didn't do it or whatever. But they didn't understood something very basic about the nature of education. That when you're doing mass education for 100 or 500 students, and you think, and it's a great ideal, okay, you want to train them in the best of theory and labs and so on. Okay, you do all that. And I think that's very important. But then to think that all of them are going to become scientists in what you think scientists should be, or they'll go to science labs or do PhD, it is not going to happen. And as it happened, as we went, and this is what we were saying in that meeting. And then a few years later, we went to the first batch which graduated, and we saw that only 25% of the students actually go on to higher education. So today you can look at all the IISc, IISER's model and ask how many people go to PhD after that. You know, I'm based on that experience, I would say maybe 25-30%, maybe a little more now if people are getting jobs. But otherwise, people are going to all kinds of things, including MBA. That's what happened to engineering education. You know, one of the greatest, what shall I say, shock to the IIT systems in the early 80s, or just around that time, was that suddenly they thought they were, you know, there's a grand national experiment of making all of these creating engineers who are going to go get their feet dirty and build the engineering world of India, right? Build all your bridges and railways and stuff. None of that stuff happened to the IIT students. One big batch of batches of students went abroad and stayed abroad, and suddenly in the 80s, the other set of very bright kids went into doing IIMs. They all migrated. They recreated MBA discipline as engineering disciplines. In the sense, even today, the significant amount of people who enter MBA programs are engineers. Very large percentage in the so-called top programs. And I just can't understand it. You know, because you have set up a whole system of exams to keep out people who are not good in some of these specific skills needed for doing engineering disciplines, like math, solving high-speed mathematical problems. And obviously, they are the only ones who will get in. Whereas you have hordes of people who are, you know, excellent in, who come from family businesses, people who are great in music and theater. There's no questions asked about that. People who are great at people management, engage, deal with people, talking to people. None of them get into these things because, you know, they can't write some stupid exam, which is completely influenced by this ideology of science. So I am saying we should be asking that question. Those of us who are not in this thing, social scientists and humanities scholars and other citizens should be asking, okay, we have given you so much money, and you have said you want all this money for these institutes because you're going to produce great scientists and technocrats. And then we find that at the end of it, only 20% are doing science. So why are we all paying all that money for them to do MBA? And this, what I'm trying to say is, to support what they are doing, I would say train them in these ways, including science communication. And we need people who are very well trained in science to write nicely about science. And that actually supports the science community. I can't understand, you know, I don't want to say this too much because there are, I mean, it's not about, you know, groups of people, but nothing in India is professional as far as if it is social science humanities. Absolutely. That is, any scientist can come and talk about anything, any discipline, any field, they'll come and give you a lecture. You cannot go, if you are not a scientist or science student, you cannot enter a science department to talk about something which you may have great interest in, about the skies and astronomy, for example. So why is it? I'm saying, look at it as it's not about complaining about scientists. What is the nature of Indian society that it allows it, and it has allowed it and continues to allow it? I'm interested only in the social. Okay, I'm not interested in the science community at all. I'm interested in the nature of our Indian societies, communities, and the kinds of problems which is coming from these kinds of communities, where we have forgotten the most basic ethical sense of living with each other in spite of all our differences. So, yeah.
Just to add one comment, I also feel like a lot of science policy and science administration positions, the minimum requirement is a PhD, and they expect only scientists to come in, which I think is a huge mistake, because recognizing and respecting people with other fields of expertise is, I think, could do a lot bring a lot of benefit to the
very true. No, and you know, the whole you know, negative way of calling people activists, you know, is really a way of putting down people who have actually had experience of the society, who have lived in it, worked with it, learned so much about it. I mean, you know, I have sat in committees where about education, okay, where people who have not done a fraction of the thinking which many of your TISS students in the masters would have done are still making great pronouncements on nature of education, how we should teach, how should India improve by doing these kinds of things. And why are they doing that? Why are they in the government things? Because they are scientists. So what I'm saying is, why does it happen? What has happened to the remaining part of the society? What has happened to our parents who are sending the 6th standard kid to schools from 6:30 to 7:30, who lives in so much stress and anxiety from that age? They've all stopped playing in the evenings. In Bangalore, at least, I don't see children, playing out in the evenings is a big problem for them because they're all doing some tuition. What are our, I mean, I'm not asking what our education is doing. I'm saying, what can we do as educationists? And many educationists have said about this. We have great tradition of wonderful thinkers of education in India who have said this and much more. Why? What is it that we are not able to do as a community, as a social, group?
We'll move to the next question from Subro. May I request Subro to please ask his question? Subro?
Yeah, hello. Is it audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Though you have pointed out in the last two questions some of the areas, I'm still pushing it a bit forward. Like I am basically pointing out at two areas. One is embodiment, another is infrastructure. Like both are related, but simultaneously one can cut the other section. So the first, and it related to these two sections, I am pointing to questions or reflections. One is that we all know that people coming from whether the science community or science students or scientists, those who otherwise stick to a very rigid idea of disciplinary practices as to what they specifically define as science, but they continue to hold on to practices like caste discrimination or untouchability and so on. But at the same time, they will resist hearing about all this from other disciplinary areas, let's say, which you had already reflected on. And the main part is the inclusion exclusion question. There a border is there where they will say that this doesn't come to rational thinking, this is a social practice, this is a religious practice, this is my personal choice, whereas you are not fit enough to comment on, let's say, chemistry or chemical reaction or a biological question or a physics question. So this is where I am talking about the embodiment question, which whereas there is a foreclosure before someone from outside comes to comment on. Whereas on the other part, if I talk of infrastructural change, this embodied perspective already resisted. Let's say if I'm trying to teach a course in a science institute, the choice maker in that science institute, let's say a director or one who will recruit, might resist that kind of approach to teach science in a classroom or even in recruitment question. So obviously, like on one hand, we know that, let's say, ISAR is recruiting these days or pushing forward philosophy of science, and some of the areas, like, let's say if I talk about philosophy of science might be one of those areas which might help science students or scientists, let's say, to rethink science in a different way, the feminist concerns within science, caste concerns in science, etc. But again, in terms of infrastructure, someone coming from a deep embodied thought about, like, this is something related to social or religious and should not be included in the curriculum, and that might again so this is a very
no, that is very
problem.
true. Sorry, just what you're saying is a major challenge. To somebody had asked a question, why STS is not set up in India and all that. There is a great opportunity, and even ISETs are not doing philosophy of science. It happened only because of one visionary leader when they set up ISER Mohali with Professor Satyamurthy, who thought this was very important, and he was influenced by his experience in IIT Kanpur, which had a good humanities department and so on. What I'm saying is the other ISERs and IITs, if you really look at it, and go and look around and ask where are the kinds of historians, philosophers, or sociologists, or scientists who should be there. And I'll say this. What does it matter? I know of examples where people have had interviews where there are no humanities scholars who are present in the hiring of humanities people. There are scientists who will sit in, who will listen to somebody presenting the job talk and interview, okay, and that is going to be their final way by which they're going to choose people. And where, you know, they don't think it's important that they get people who are within the field, who are going to be experts, who are going to ask some question, get some good people into it. And so there is a question you have to ask: who are the kinds of people whom they're comfortable with, whom they want to get into these departments? They get people who they think are not going to be asking questions to science, not even threatening the science. Look, there is no way humanities can ever threaten science. We are nobody. We are just doing our work. And yet, you cannot be part of any of the deliberations, although those are public institutions. And, you know, again, it's not about individuals, but if you think you're saying all the right things about how great science is, for any of you who are trying to get a job in our IITs and IISers and IIScs, let me tell you, try that out. Just say that, oh, everything great, what they're doing is great. We are going to be cheerleaders. We are not going to be asking you uncomfortable questions about other things. But that's the government should be asking them all these questions. There is no accountability anywhere to these institutions. Who is asking the question, okay, what are the kinds of people you have hired? What are they doing? Nothing. So, like in India, I always keep saying it's a problem of institutions, not a problem of science here. If you have leaders who are open and visionary, things will happen. The moment they go, it will go. You know, and like I always like saying, Indian institutions have personality disorders. They don't have institutional disorders. They all function like a person. You know, one patriarchal head is there, it will function like a family according to his understanding of family. And if he's good, you're lucky. If not, forget it. Close down the institute.
Yeah. If I like add on, like focusing on your or Gopal's works which you had been doing on for let's say not cracked mirror, like even before that, what the problem we are facing in terms of, let's say, democratic concern about the country and the discipline and the institute, it seems somewhere they're merging, and it is again calling for rethinking from a minoritarian perspective. I'm talking of minoritarian here in terms of disciplinary ideas, because in terms of science institutes, we all know that even if humanities or philosophy of science or this is even there, it is as if treated as something which is, you know, it's there because we need to keep it, but you should not be serious about that. Rather, you continue to focus on the majoritarian idea or the what had been going on for a long time, that established hegemonic view of science. So,
okay, yeah, I'm going to talk on democracy on Monday. So I'm going to talk on democracy and politics and science on Monday. So I'll really come back to that. Huh?
Yeah,
And
I think we can take this later. Yeah, we have just a couple of questions, one from Rohini and the other from Durga Prasad. So I request Rohini to quickly ask her question, and I request audience to be quite brief in their question. Rohini. Rohini, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello, sir. Good evening, sir. Sir, I have been a teacher myself for just a couple of years, and then I have seen how children enjoy when a story is told to them about how a discovery happened or how an invention took place. So I really enjoyed the session today thoroughly. But at the same time, when I was doing my B.Ed, we were taught Bloom's taxonomy, where a lot of emphasis was laid on that the children should be taken from knowledge to creation, okay, the kind of hierarchy that is created from knowledge to comprehension, then it takes to like evaluation and creation, and how children are completely made to think that creating a new thing is of a very, it's really nice, and then not understanding the deeper details or the emotional connect between things and the society. All these aspects are not covered in the taxonomy, and I think the shaping of the teachers, when it happens like that, definitely the classrooms are getting affected. So what would be your take on this?
You mean, can you just repeat the last part? I just heard some sound. I lost part of that.
Okay. So I was asking the Bloom's taxonomy that is taught
Yeah.
in the B.Ed curriculum. It
Correct.
asks us to take the students from knowledge to application and then to
correct.
creation. So somewhere this entire concept of enjoying science, knowing the deeper principles behind it or the philosophy behind it is lost somewhere. So if in case you get to change this taxonomy, how would you do it?
Okay, good. Yeah, sorry, that's clear now. Actually, I was mentioning earlier, and this may sound very fanciful, but let me say it. Let's see how we can work through this, right? That it all depends on what I think of as knowledge. So as I said, I was very struck when I was doing this, reading the commentary of the Nagarjuna's work by this monk. And it's I think it's a 14th century text or something like that, or written in 1403. I forget the exact date of that, okay? And the point there is they are saying repeatedly the point about the Buddhist idea of knowledge is that knowledge has to have you want to call something as a knowledge when it can have a principle of compassion inbuilt into it. So now we think knowledge is one which if you tell me what the correct answer is, that is knowledge. Or if you are able to do something, that's correct knowledge. What if I introduce the principle? So I'm saying new taxonomies of this kind, where the question is not just about even creativity, which is sufficiently vague and diffused, right? Or bringing in other forms of intelligence. We can expand it with gardeners and other kinds of categories, but to bring in categories which have to do with, compassion for others, for example. Those are, so in other words, for example, suppose I say from this taxonomy, I begin with basic learning, with whatever basic factual learning, and move towards a compassionate living, co-living with others. Why should that not be seen as the best form of knowledge? That you get the most marks for it. I mean, all MBA program CAT exams should choose people, on their moral temper. You have half the guys who are corrupt and doing all these things because you don't test them before you get them into these programs. So I would do, if I was doing a good business program, I want people who are morally sensitive, socially sensitive human beings. So I definitely think there are possibilities to relook at these taxonomies to say, where is it I want to move from factual knowledge, the most simplest case of example, application not just in terms of pragmatics or making more money or successful implementation, but application in terms of compassion, social living, which means that, we train a student that you are a bad student if you think you can mock people who get less marks than you, or that you set up hierarchies within class in those kinds of forms. These are practices. These are not difficult to teach. So I definitely think that's one, it's good you triggered that thought, but I think there are many ways of thinking through these points, I think.
Last question for the day, perhaps from DP. DP, could you please ask your question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good evening, Sundar. So my question is, so I see education in connection with science. It's much closer to society. Like it's a context where larger forces in society can directly play out because parents and teachers are. It's more closer to society. So in that sense, how much do you think the current priorities in education system, like towards marks in the assessments and others, are shaped by larger social and economical conditions and systems in society? As this because these priorities like towards merit and competition that you said, and also situations like where we have 6th standard students going towards IIT and others. So I see these could be directly hooked to the primary function of education as perceived by our society as a livelihood provider. In that sense, like all our choices or decisions would be primarily driven by better economic or livelihood providers. So
Yeah.
that's my question.
Yeah. Okay. This is, of course, goes to the heart of what we want to, what we mean when we talk of education. But let's imagine an alternative possibility. Okay, because parents are not always like this, right? I mean, I'm of course older than all of you there, perhaps. So, I mean, at least when I was in school, I didn't have this kind of pressures for me or my friends on homework, coaching classes, even marks, and so on. You know, and there are, all these are aspirational parents, but the society, in a sense, did not have it because the whole social system is not structured towards valuing these kind of things. So what I mean by this is this: imagine tomorrow, at one stroke, you get rid of the entrance exam to IITs in the way they are now. Okay, it's very odd. Again, people who are making some of these education policies they say we want to be the best in the world, we want to be ranked very high, and many of them have experienced many of the universities are ranked on the top, etc. And still they are not able to follow a simple thing, which we know well. So, for example, if you want to get into a good American university, as you know, it is not just your marks alone. You have to do hundreds of things, and that's another kind of competition, which is way beyond this competition here, which is just marks. There you have to have written a book and publish a paper before you apply for a BA program, depending on all the big schools and so on. But the point is, when there you are able to draw upon a person with multiple capacities and skills, including social work, working with NGOs, etc., which are factored into their final package before their choice, how is it that we don't think we can do it for our IITs and all these government institutions? What is it that we are lazy about doing? Without recognizing we are destroying millions of children in India because somebody is lazy to evaluate in a more complex way how to take the best people into the system. If you remove those competitive exams at one stroke and you remove the nature of choosing people, you have removed at one stroke some of the most important. It will take into account the questions of representation, and it will resist various forms of exclusion. And also particular, like another question which was asked was about exclusion through language. So all those kinds of issues can be addressed if we completely think of a very different way of defining what is valuable in education and what is valuable in a job. I agree with you, and I think livelihood is most important, and that anxiety is which drives education is present in parents. But what if your Infosys and Wipro are hiring people based on their overall record of many things which they have done, and what kind of families they come from, what kind of people they are? And if you do that at one shot, parents will be the happiest at one level. And this kind of competition which has reduced, made enemies out of children and between friends. And I'm not saying I don't think educationists can do much about it, I presume. But because many of them have spoken, they're very powerful figures. But when I see this continuing, I just don't get it. And you have these alternate schools, but they're too elitist. They're catering to too small a fraction of the people who are already very well off, and it doesn't matter to them. In fact, I think some of them deserve some kind of exam writing, which will put them, bring them into some kind of a different kind of rigor. But all I'm saying is we have seem to have lost the plot there. And I'm saying something which all of you know this very well. But I'm saying, as a social process, how do we as a society start thinking about education, which includes our parents, where we talk to them about it? Where is the public discourse on education? Where is the public discourse which can tackle the parents' angst? And now, of course, the enormous amount of money they are paying to enter into many of these institutions, just to do a bachelor's, the kind of money which people are charging. So, yeah, I don't know. I probably didn't, but I'm just, I'm saying what do we do, especially as,
So would an approach like which looks at education not in isolation, but looks at education and the knowledge systems in connection with the larger economic systems provide some solution. Like I think partly like Gandhi's philosophy sort of touches upon it, but sadly that experiment couldn't continue for longer. Like incorporating the means of production as well as the knowledge systems together. I mean, things of that kind perhaps could be.
No, I think it's I mean, Naeem Talim, I've seen it in many places. I've studied some Gandhian organizations and looked at their schools in particular. And a couple of years back, I was in this place in Kausani, in above Almoda in Uttaranchal, where there is a great school, which many of you people in education might know, this Lakshmi Ashram, which was set up by Gandhi and runs largely for girls, orphans and poor girls, etc. But, you know, I stayed for a week with them, and it was such an eye-opening experience of knowing how systems can still function very well, that some core ideas of education. It's very difficult for the system to sustain because it's run by two, Gandhian, very committed Gandhian, Radhaben and others. But the point is, the kind model of education was very close to what I think would, in my sense, an ideal model of real teaching, which includes physical labor, which includes labor in the kitchen, which includes labor of cleaning, plus learning maths and science, plus singing. I mean, it's, and they do the shopping, they do everything. I mean, it's a very different kind of experience. And the funniest thing there was this. When I went in, the 10th standard kids were not, or 12th standard kids were not there. And I was told they had gone out on a Padayatra. And I was there for the 3 days when they came back. So we were there for the common meeting. They had in the morning, they have this prayer. And then these 3 girls who had gone on there, the 3 girls who came and spoke, who went from this 12th standard students, they had gone on a march with the stick and all that, like small Gandhis, girls, against the alcohol movement in Uttaranchal at that time, run by many of the women groups there. So they went as part of their learning and come back and talk to these students about their experiences and what they did. Now, what I'm trying to say is, these are changing the ways we look at the very meaning of what it is to be educated. So, as educationists, how do we bring this into the public discourse? So we tell parents, we get parents to ask the question, is this what you want your child to be educated? Is this the kind of education you want for your child? Or can we think of a better meaning of education? And here, given the various contexts, every religious tradition is actually traditions of education, very interestingly. We can draw upon various forms of learning which are present in these cultural forms. And it gives us a great weapon to have to say, this is not education at all. And therefore, this is not what you should be desiring for your children. So at that level, I must say, although from the draft of the latest new education policy with Kasturirangan's thing, it begins with this vision of this interdisciplinary, which is one very good step. I don't know the logistics of it. I think is very, very difficult, and but within the text, I wrote a critical piece of humanity, the way they have looked at humanities education within the NEP, but I still think it is a complete change in re-looking at our, for example, engineering institute, by saying that there should be no mono-discipline institutions, no mono-engineering institutions, they should have to be interdisciplinary. It is a step, but repeated things like this might help change. So we need to tackle the people who are pushing for this, who support it, which is parents who really can make a change eventually down the line.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have had a wonderful session, and it has invoked more questions.
Yeah, I know, especially to all of you, it's your field, so
So I think there are some questions which are unanswered, and we also need to raise more questions in these domains, and also because it ties to, I think, a fundamental nature of human learning per se. So Yeah, so maybe we have some questions coming in and we can take it
Yeah,
forward.
please send me that and also send some questions they send in. And
Yeah.
as I said, I want to come back and look at the questions of, politics and science, a little bit of democracy and other, some bit of Marxism and so on. So let's see how, try
Okay.
and tie up some of this thing. Where education is the central core of anything we mean by social.
Right,
you know.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we look forward to sessions and we are
Thank
really
you. Yeah.
excited and we are hoping that this journey continues and sustains even beyond these lecture series.
Yeah, I hope so. That'll be very nice. Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ritesh.
Thank you,
We'll
Professor.
see you on Tuesday.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. And thank you all audience for joining in. Yeah.